In this video, we will look at an example of an enterprise risk management risk profiling activity. Let's consider the overall process, and then we'll look at each step separately. First, you identify a specific objective, then you want to identify risks that can prevent you from achieving that objective. So the second step is to identify the risk. For example, you might ask, what events in the next 3 years can prevent us from achieving this objective? Identify as many risks as you can. There may be more than one risk, but we'll focus on one at a time to illustrate the process here. For each risk, identify one or more simple scenarios for how the risk is most likely to come to pass. Multiple scenarios for a given risk are possible. Here's an example from a risk avoidance perspective. First, you identify the hazard. In this example, it is Asian carp. Second, you identify the harm the hazard can cause. In this example, monetary damage to commercial fisheries is the harm. Next, you identify a possible sequence of events that result in your hazard causing the harm you have identified. Again, in this example, a pathway must exist, the carp must arrive at it, survive passage along it, establish a breeding colony in the new watershed, and then spread throughout the Great Lakes, resulting in the loss of commercial fisheries. Now let's consider a risk-taking example. This begins by identifying dredging a waterway as an opportunity for potential gain. Next, we identify the potential gain itself, monetary transportation cost savings. The sequence of events is the channel is deepened, the mix of vessels in the fleet changes, more cargo is shipped along the deeper waterway in vessels with deeper drafts that make shipping cheaper. Let's walk through the process now. Here are two sample objectives. Imagine the goal is to deliver quality water resource solutions and services. And the primary objective under this goal is to deliver studies and projects on time and within budget. Imagine a second goal is to manage the life cycle of water resources infrastructure systems to consistently deliver reliable and sustainable performance. And the primary objective of this goal is to apply life cycle portfolio management strategies. Enterprise risk management requires the prior identification of the entity's strategic goals. Now, we want to identify risks that threaten that first priority objective. We begin by asking, what events in the next 3 years, or some reasonable time frame, can prevent us from delivering studies and projects on time and within budget? One risk is the lack of accountability for delays and overruns. The harm is a study is over budget and beyond schedule. One scenario by which it could happen would be the need to make payroll results in doing more analysis, which causes the study to fail to meet its commitments, and nothing happens. There's no censure, no penalty for doing so. A second risk is the internal review process. The harm is the same. Scenarios include too many reviews, work poorly done gets sent back for fixing, and inconsistency in review that results in earlier agreements being upended. A third risk could be insufficient personnel resources. Scenarios include not enough people, inexperienced people doing slow or poor quality work, and people who are too busy with too much work to do. This kind of work continues until all the risks of concern and their feasible scenarios have been identified. Once the scenarios have been identified, it's time to assign a consequence rating for each risk. Review the scenarios that have just been described and decide in your own mind which of these represents a credible scenario that is the most harmful to the strategic objective. Then, using the definitions below, assign a consequence that most closely resembles this impact. The risk rating associated with that impact will be your vote. So if you think the risk would have a high consequence, meaning the consequence of this risk could prevent or highly impair your ability to achieve this strategic goal, you would vote high. If you think the consequence of this risk could significantly affect your ability to achieve this strategic goal, you would vote medium. And if you think the consequence of this risk will not significantly affect your ability to achieve this strategic goal, you would vote low. Risk profiling is not risk assessment, so you can vote to get a sense of the risk's consequence profile. I suggest you use an automated real-time voting app to count the consequence votes. Participants can use a free service like Poll Everywhere. They text their vote and see the votes tallied in real time in a PowerPoint presentation. Here's a sample of a vote tally. The voting is followed by a conversation to explore the rationale behind the responses and to probe into the reasons behind the diversity of opinion. Would anyone who voted high or low care to share your rationale for those votes? Let's hear from the people who voted medium. Following a conversation like that, you might say, now that we've heard a range of perspectives and arguments on the potential magnitude of this risk, let's see how many of you have changed your minds as a result. And at this point, you re-vote to see if anyone has been convinced to change their vote. At some point, you go with the majority vote. You would repeat this process for the probability. Using the probability scale below, assign a probability of the risk coming to pass with an impact as large as was assigned by the group in our consequence rating. If you think the risk is more likely to occur than not, vote high. If you think the risk is as likely to occur as not, vote medium. And if you think the risk is more likely to not occur than to occur, vote low. The vote would be followed by a conversation and a revote. We use a risk matrix or a heat map to record the votes. You can use as many categories as you like for the consequences and probability. And you can have quantitative definitions of the categories if you like. In fact, categories can be developed specifically for each risk. Here in this example, we use the simple categories identified earlier. Here are the hypothetical results of a vote on the three risks identified. Accountability and review have medium consequences, but there is a high probability these consequences will occur. The personnel risk has high consequences, but there is only a medium probability they will occur. Now what? 3 amber risks could be worse than a single red risk. So now you have to establish a risk appetite. Look at these inherent risks. If they are not acceptable, you must specify a risk appetite. That can be a simple qualitative statement that says something like the appetite for over budget and over schedule studies is low. Or a quantitative appetite could be established. One might say we will not accept more than 5% of all studies being over budget or over schedule. If the profiled risks are beyond the entity's risk appetite, these risks must be actively managed. That would include those who establish the profile and appetite, as well as everyone in the organization with responsibility in this area.